Today I'm taking a page out of the old content creator handbook. This is my first ever Q&A video where I'll be answering some follower submitted questions. Should be fun. Let's get started. How to use chromatic lines in soloing without them sounding messy. Yeah, there's a lot of ways you could think about this. You got 12 notes. You're playing in whatever key, 7 of those notes are in, the other 5 are out. So the question is, how do you get those other 5 to sound in? Well, from a purely mechanical perspective, you got to understand that tonal music operates on function. There are inherent expectations baked into everything you play in the context of a major or minor key. There are structural forces pulling harmonies and different notes to want to resolve this way and that. This is still true even with those 5 chromatic notes. In a harmonic context, those 5 chromatic notes often present themselves as part of a secondary dominant or some modal mixture chord. In the case of a secondary dominant, the third of that chord acts as a leading tone to whatever the secondary dominant is meant to resolve to. So for example, in the key of C, you get a D7 chord. That's a secondary dominant to the 5 chord, G. D7 wants to go to G. The third of D7 is F sharp. F sharp is the leading tone to G, and it's also not a note in the key of C major. It's one of the 5 out notes. But in this context, it makes complete sonic sense and there's nothing messy about it. When you're trying to use chromatic notes when soloing, a great starting point is to think along these lines. Like any chromatic note you play is a leading tone to a diatonic pitch. And because you're mainly playing single notes when you're soloing, you're less bound by the denser harmonic structure of, say, a secondary dominant. Obviously, you have to consider the chords you're playing over, but you can operate with a lot more fluidity in the notes you play versus if you're actually playing the chords in the rhythm section sense. But basically, any note that's out is a half step away from a note that's in. So resolve it to a note that's in. Ideally, you're aiming those chromatic notes at chord tones. So maybe you've got, I don't know, like E minor 7. So any chromatic notes you play should be aimed at resolving into any of those chord tones. So that's mechanically how you could think about it, but the more important thing is the emotional intent behind any of those things you do. A note that's out will sound wrong if you're shy about it. If you play a wrong note, you should be excited. Now you get to put some energy into it and then resolve it into a note that's in the key. Once you give it that context, it sounds right. Remember, the prefix of chromatic is chroma, and chroma means color. Those chromatic notes are where all your color lives. Why are less notes usually better than more notes? When I was a kid, my cousin told me a joke called the Blue Plate Special. This is one of those jokes where it's super long and drawn out and there's a lot of repetitive stuff in it and it's just generally agonizing to sit through. Like, it starts with the guy in the story ordering the Blue Plate Special at this diner, and it launches him into this whole series of events where he gets physically assaulted by a bunch of people, he goes to prison for 25 years, all kinds of horrible things happen to him as apparent punishment for the simple act of ordering the Blue Plate Special. And it takes like 15-20 minutes of telling this joke to relay all these horrible things. The whole time you're wondering, what is the Blue Plate Special and why is this guy getting his life ruined for ordering it? And at the end of the joke, he's right about to get the closure he's been after, and then he gets hit by a bus and dies, and so the moral of the story is look both ways before crossing the street. So it's this whole big thing with all kinds of superfluous detail that has nothing to do with the moral of the story. Obviously, with this joke, that's kind of the point, but still. This is sort of how I think of more notes versus less notes. It's like conveying meaning with more words versus less words. Like, I can tell you to look both ways before crossing the street without wasting 20 minutes of your time. If we're talking about soloing, you've got more tools to be expressive besides just the number of notes you play. You've got dynamics, you've got tone color, you've got articulation, you've got rhythm, you've got silence. One of my favorite guitarists to point people towards on this subject is David Gilmour. He doesn't play a ton of notes, but he says a lot with the notes he does play. And that is more interesting and compelling than playing a lot of notes really fast all the time. An exercise I sometimes make my students try is to improvise something using only 4 notes. Say as much as you can with just those 4 notes. I also think less is more in regards to voicing chords. We're all taught these big 6-string bar chords, but it's usually better to avoid voicing chords like that, especially if you're playing with other people. A triad is just 3 notes. If you have all this excessive doubling going on all the time across multiple instruments, things start to sound oversaturated and potentially muddy. You can get the point across with a lot less, and it will usually sound better. Changing the rhythm's backbeat affecting the melodies and breakdowns. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Maybe you're asking about, like, 2009 breakdowns? Breakdowns were a staple of metalcore bands back in the day. I guess they still are, but I think of bands like Attack Attack, The Devil Wears Prada, A Day to Remember. That's high school stuff for me. And it's always this halftime thing with some very rhythmic, palm-muted open string riff, double kick matching the rhythm of the guitars, snare on 2 and 4, wailing on the china, and the whole band does this choreographed full body headbang thing in a line. I always thought they were pretty cool. It takes all the energy of the song and funnels it straight into the rhythm. It makes for the most intense part of the song. Lots of modern prog metal bands still put breakdowns in their songs, but they're usually less cheesy than the kind I'm talking about. Changing the rhythm's backbeat. So you can do all kinds of crazy rhythms in the guitar and match the kick drum to it, but if you break that rhythmic expectation that the snare is going to hit on 2 and 4, it can really throw the listener for a ride. In a good way, if you do it right. Maybe it hits on the and of 4 or something, or maybe you have a silence on beat 1, establishing a pattern and breaking the pattern for contrast, right? That just adds to the rhythmic excitement. I don't really know what else to say on this. How do I solo over non-diatonic metal riffs? You could do what Kerry King does and just play random notes, but seriously, this is kind of a loaded question. How you would go about that is kind of case dependent. I mean, if your riffs don't adhere to a diatonic scale in any sense, you can't really solo with a diatonic scale, right? I mean, you could, but it might sound weird. It depends. But even if it's a totally chromatic riff, you've probably got some kind of tonal center being established, a particular note that the riff repeatedly aims for. I'd start by finding that center and see what I could do from there. Maybe some exotic scale based on that note. Maybe some generally minor pentatonic stuff with some chromaticisms. Maybe just play in E minor. I don't know. It's hard to give a general answer to that question. Short answer is, it depends. Is there any do's or don'ts? Don't clap on 1 and 3. Do clap on 2 and 4. Yeah, so this was fun. I may do more Q&A videos like this in the future if it's something you guys are even interested in. I don't know. I thought I'd try it. At the time of recording, I am accepting new private Zoom students. If you are at all interested and would like to learn more about all that, feel free to message me. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.